It's been on everyone's mind whether there's a new console war. What are the exclusives? Which system has the best graphics? It's been as hotly contested as PC versus Mac. We're talking about the Sony PlayStation versus the Microsoft Xbox. The two tech giants have been at odds with one another for nearly 2 decades, ever since Microsoft decided to throw its hat into the video game console ring with the Xbox. Microsoft has served as the underdog, always in PlayStation's shadow, but they still pose a threat to Sony's long-standing seat on the throne as the #1 game console company. How did this rivalry begin exactly? And how has it waged on throughout the years during each of the last 3 generations? The history of this rivalry must begin with how these two titans began in the first place. Sony was already deep into the video game industry before Microsoft, as they started way back in the late 80s. The man who would later be dubbed the father of the PlayStation was one Ken Kutaragi, who was a manager at Sony's software engineering department. The console that would make him famous actually started as a joint venture between Sony and Nintendo. The two companies were going to create a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Famicom, Japan's Super Nintendo. It was kept tightly under wraps by Nintendo, but Sony unveiled the project in June 1991. However, not a day later, Nintendo announced it would be breaking its ties with Sony, opting to go with Philips instead to make the Philips CDI. Already, PlayStation's conception was born in revenge and scorned deals. While that is where Sony began, the first PlayStation would be released in 1994 and would mark Sony's first console in a long line that would make Sony one of the most recognizable names in the video game industry. While Sony was enjoying a lofty career with the success of the PlayStation and eventual PS1, a smaller version of the first PlayStation, the turn of the millennium was the dawn of a new era with Microsoft. The year was 1999, and in that year, the PlayStation 2 was announced, years before any competitor would make an announcement on a new console. Today, we know the PlayStation 2 as perhaps the most well-known Sony console in their lineup for having an expansive library of games that was still selling well into the next generation of consoles after it. It was surely the console to beat for Nintendo, and during this time, another company would throw their hat into the ring. Microsoft announced they would be entering the console market with their debut product, the Xbox. While the Xbox did well in America due to the brand power of Microsoft and smash hits like Halo Combat Evolved, the Xbox did very poorly in the international market, which was dominated by Nintendo and Sony at the time. It wouldn't be until the Xbox 360 that Microsoft would have a console that could go toe-to-toe with Sony. To do this, Microsoft underwent a metamorphosis of sorts to redesign the console from the ground up, not only giving it more power and HD graphics, but also a softer, lighter design that would be more appealing to the Japanese and international markets, which was a top priority for Microsoft going into the next gen. Just like Sony had done with the PlayStation 2, Microsoft had released the Xbox 360 before anyone else could unveil their consoles. This would be the console that made Sony take notice and helped set up the battlefield for the war to come between Sony and Microsoft. The source of this rivalry really dates all the way back to 2000, when the PS2 had launched and Microsoft released the Xbox a year later in 2001, already behind the PlayStation 2. Given the massive lead and the brand familiarity, the PS2 outsold the Xbox 5-1 and cost Microsoft an estimated $5 to $7 billion over the 4 years of the original Xbox's lifespan. Despite having innovations like Xbox Live and a massive success with Halo, people just didn't like the system itself. Of course, Microsoft wasn't the only one with a common enemy. Peter Moore had a bone to pick with Sony. In 1999, he became Sega of America's president just in time for the North American release of Sega's final console, the Dreamcast. Now, the story and history of the Dreamcast is left for another time, but the lifespan of the Dreamcast was short-lived, to say the least. There are many factors that led to its demise, but one undisputed factor was the amazing success of the PlayStation 2. It was easy to say that Moore had an axe to grind, as he publicly stated that the PS2 had hurt his console. Moore would leave Sega in 2003 and be picked up by Microsoft to be the VP of Interactive Entertainment. He would leave just in time for the release of Halo 2, and as a publicity stunt, tattooed the release date on his arm. Moore would repeat this stunt for GTA 4. Going into this, Xbox had a mission. They were still the underdogs in this fight, and would need to create a console that could compete with the likes of Sony's PlayStation. Out of the many moves the two companies had made against one another to be the best on the market, there are two pivotal instances, one for each company, that could be described as catastrophic losses. For Microsoft, it was the infamous Red Ring of Death that absolutely destroyed the legacy of the original Xbox 360, and for Sony, it was the PlayStation 3's initial launch. Let's first look at the Red Ring of Death, cited as one of the worst video game hardware failures in modern gaming. With Xbox wanting to be the first on the market ahead of Sony, and Sony working on the PS3 as early as 2001, coming in second place wasn't an option for the team, so corners had to be cut. One of the big ways they cut costs on production was hiring third-party companies to develop chips and hardware for the system. This was cheaper than doing everything in-house, which is what Sony had done previously. This strategy did have some benefits in the short term because IBM ended up selling Microsoft the specs for the PlayStation 3's core processor. Any one of these components from any one of these companies could result in a faulty system. All in all, the new Xbox 360 was made of nearly 1,000 parts from 200 different companies, all in a case that was lighter and smaller than their previous console. Of course, Xbox would have its goal and have a launch date set for the 2005 holiday season, whereas Sony would release the PlayStation 3 in spring of 2006. This left the holiday season all to Microsoft. Near the end of development, Microsoft pulled key developers from Xbox 360 to work on the Zune, the MP3 player that no one remembers. What was perhaps more of a detriment for the Xbox was that Microsoft didn't develop enough debugging and testing machines for their system. This meant that units fresh off the assembly line weren't debugged or optimized to the fullest extent. They saved $2 million on a $25 million deal by ordering just a third of the machines they needed to optimize their systems. Game developers were voicing concerns about the system not being able to handle the games they were making. Often, the system's motherboard would warp and the graphics card would overheat too easily. All of the common complaints had one common theme: heat. The original Xbox 360 generated a lot of heat. All of those components crammed together had very little breathing room and caused the system to overheat faster than it should have. According to VentureBeat, by 2005, Microsoft's yield on the Xbox was around 68%, which translates to about one-third of consoles coming off the line being unshippable to their distributors. Among growing concerns from Microsoft engineers, the top brass at the company made the decision to go ahead and release the console before it was truly ready. Due to a less than satisfactory yield ratio, when the consoles that were good to ship got sold, they were looking at a shortage of consoles. People were having to settle with eBay flippers, and people were upset about the shortage. But the thing is, Microsoft didn't have a shortage. They did have warehouses full of consoles. It's just that they didn't work. Despite all this, victory was still just out of reach. Even after coming out with the hot ticket item and releasing it before Sony, Microsoft still lost to the PlayStation 2 in 2005, which cumulatively sold over 100 million units that holiday season. But of course, aside from the launch, Microsoft set out a new goal for the Xbox 360 in competition with Sony and their upcoming PlayStation 3. First to 10 million wins. There would be an obvious problem with that. The faulty systems Microsoft had shelved were beginning to pile up. Still at a 68% yield rate, some sources had said the number of shelved faulty units were coming up on 500,000. Peter Moore was on the defensive, stating that these failing units were just isolated incidences. However, mounting public opinion wasn't working in Microsoft's favor. It wasn't an epidemic yet, but Microsoft had to do something. Soon after, they released a $199 Slim HD DVD drive for the Xbox 360 to compete with Sony's Blu-ray. Halfway through the Xbox 360's lifespan, Microsoft would release a new and improved version of the system called the Xbox 360 Elite that promised bigger and better memory and hardware. To try and attack the cost-effective route, they also released an Xbox Arcade version that was cheaper all around and set at $275. Still, Microsoft engineers were frustrated that they were being told to focus on future products and newer things rather than working on the problem at hand with their failing Xbox 360s. This would all come to a head when nearly a year after launch, the rate at which Xbox 360s were being returned was less than satisfactory. While the top brass were determined to keep moving forward, there was a problem Microsoft could no longer keep sweeping under the rug. The solution the company ended up going with was to extend the warranty of all consoles in the original run by 1 year. However, engineers were still stumped as to what exactly was going on, as the 3 red lights in the Red Ring of Death only signaled a general hardware failure, and a pattern as to what exactly was failing couldn't be found. In the end, Microsoft had to eat the tremendous loss and release newer products like the Elite and Xbox Slim to compensate. While Microsoft's cost of trying to come out ahead came from within by cutting costs and overlooking glaring issues with their products, Sony had the opposite problem. After the massive success of the PlayStation 2, Sony felt like they had nothing to worry about going into the next generation with the PlayStation 3, which they had been developing since 2001. But soon after the launch of the PlayStation 3, things were beginning to look a little odd with Sony. It really all started with the E3 press conference. Regarded by many to be the worst in E3 history, PlayStation 3 was already beginning to look a little shaky due to the third console curse, a superstition in the gaming industry that the third console in a franchise is consistently the worst in the lineup. Sony had already gotten some flack at the Consumer Electronics Expo and would completely redesign their system for E3. While they wanted a spring 2006 launch date, many believed it wouldn't make that date. They didn't. It was at E3 2006 where Sony unveiled the new PlayStation 3 to the public and started off with a bombshell people didn't want to hear. The price would be either $499 or $599. This was more than a 100% increase from the PlayStation 2's price. Well, the rhetoric that was being spun at the conference was that the increase in price was justified for the futuristic cutting-edge technology, and that if people really wanted it, working a few extra hours to afford one was all the more worth it. This sentiment of having to work overtime just to afford this console didn't sit well with anyone. Even some loyal PlayStation fans weren't convinced, and either stuck with the PlayStation 2 or switched to the Xbox 360, which was more appealing this time around to Japanese consumers with their new design. The main reason for this price hike was due to the fact the PS3 had a built-in Blu-ray player. At the time, getting a Blu-ray player for under $600 wasn't too crazy. In their defense, Blu-ray would go on to be a killer to the HD DVD that was being pushed at the time with the Xbox 360. Blu-ray discs held more data and were more durable than DVDs. Xbox would eventually make the switch from HD DVD to Blu-ray in their future devices. Still, at the time, $600 for a new system was just too much for most people. Today's prices still wouldn't come close to the PS3's launch price. Peter Moore of Microsoft was just head over heels for the PS3's launch price, saying in an interview that a customer could buy both an Xbox 360 and a Nintendo Wii combined for less than the price of one PlayStation 3. So what did the Japanese consumer have at launch for the PS3 if they sunk $600 into it? Well, at launch there were only 6 games: Blast Factor, Kido Senshi Gundam Target in Sight, Ridge Racer 7 Miyasoto Miyoshi, Kyodai Naizo Sega Golf Club, Resistance Jinrui Botsuraku no Hi, and Genji Kamui Soran. Needless to say, none of these are award-winning must-haves. While the North American launch titles were much better, it still didn't warrant a $600 price tag. Of course, it wasn't just the price tag that held the PS3 back at launch, but also the hardware. While it was nothing compared to the Red Ring, the PS3's cell processor had some issues. It was marketed to developers as a CPU with tremendous potential, but most developers didn't take the bait, and Xbox ended up having a better rapport with third-party developers. Even Valve wasn't very willing to come on board with the cell processor as it deviated too far from the conventional means. In the end, the cell processor was all that it had promised, but by then it had garnered such a bad reputation that Sony ended up dropping it entirely. As if the hype around the PS3 wasn't shaky enough, the actual launch date itself was plagued with disaster. Not only were there shortages reported throughout the US on launch, but things turned violent. People were shot at, assaulted, and stepped on in order to get their systems, most of which were going to eBay to flip them due to the short supply. In the end, this led to Sony selling just over 500,000 consoles on launch, an absolutely abysmal number compared to the PS2. While the PS3 had a shaky start, perhaps one of the worst launches in gaming history, the PS3 would still go on to outsell the Xbox 360 in its lifespan. It may have lost the early game due to an arrogant mentality that fans will simply work harder to afford their console, but the price of the console would come down, and that is when people began buying them en masse again. While the rivalry between Microsoft and Sony could largely be described as a series of increasingly risky business ventures and innovations in order to one-up each other, on January 20th, 2009, Sony Entertainment chairman Kazuo Hirai was asked about Xbox as a competitor in an interview. He was quoted saying, "You need a word that describes something that lacks longevity. Last time I checked, they've never had a console that's been on the market for more than 4 or 5 years, and we've committed to a 10-year life cycle, so you do the math." This was in the midst of the Xbox's growing red ring of death problem. Of course, Microsoft wasn't going to take this lying down, and later, during an interview with Bitbag, the head of Xbox 360 and Xbox Live management, Aaron Greenberg, responded to Hirai saying, "This sounds like an old hardware company that's comfortable with its market position. That complacent attitude is out of touch with where the industry and consumer is today," insinuating that Sony as a company had become so complacent that they were no longer willing to innovate their products or games. It wasn't the first time Sony had gotten hostile with words during public events. Earlier that month, Sony took a shot at both Microsoft and Nintendo for selling what Sony considered to be add-ons, noting that the Xbox requires additional money, multiple upgrades, and additional external devices, putting a burden on the wallet and adds clutter to the entertainment center. Xbox 360 spokesperson David Dennis rebutted Sony's harsh statement in an interview with Edge by saying that having two different consoles was intended from the beginning, explaining that there existed a console that was more expensive but included a lot of things casual gamers wouldn't need, so the consumer has options when buying an Xbox. However, Dennis then retorted that Sony having one console that was $200 more expensive and had a bunch of features the average gamer wouldn't need wasn't the best strategy given the economic situation. Keep in mind that during this time, the US was going through a recession that started back in 2008. Of course, Sony hasn't always been the one to fire off their mouth first. In May of 2008, Grand Theft Auto 4 was released for both consoles, and the initial sales report from Newsweek reported that 64% of GTA 4 sales were going to Xbox while the remainder was going to PlayStation. Greenberg once again responded, toting these numbers, saying that these sales results add GTA 4 to a long list of franchises that have switched over from PlayStation to find a new home on Xbox 360, similar to what happened last year with titles like Madden and Guitar Hero. However, there was a small flaw in Greenberg's bragging. At the time, the game was being digitally downloaded 3 times as much on PS3s as Xbox 360s, so the smaller 2-to-1 sales numbers for GTA was technically underwhelming. Sony spokesperson Peter Dill responded by saying that if Microsoft had a 3-to-1 install ratio, they wouldn't be bragging about a 60-40 split in sales with Sony. This kind of one-upmanship was prevalent even in the most recent console reveal. During the Xbox One's coverage, it was revealed that the console was required to be online 24/7, and that backwards compatibility and the idea of used games were going to be a thing of the past. While this might have been thought of at the time as forward-thinking, many people didn't like the idea that they would no longer be able to share physical copies of games or buy used games. To capitalize on this, Sony made a video mocking this decision by having 2 Sony execs demonstrating how you can share games on the PlayStation 4 by simply handing the game off to your friend. The video is now famous, and Microsoft was left with no other option but to backtrack on their original claims. Through their careers, both companies have made claims to their console's success only to be checked by the other side. There are many more examples of this type of banter going on between Sony and Microsoft, but these examples suffice in highlighting the kind of public decorum both companies would take, and how they would respond to any kind of shade being thrown at them. You would think the dust has settled since consoles today are beginning to look more and more alike. Well, sadly, the battle between Sony and Microsoft wages on into this current gen with the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Both of these consoles debuted in 2013, and aside from a few blunders in presentation and marketing, performed similarly. But the rivalry between the two companies meant any inch or any innovation warranted a new console, which is why, halfway through the console's life, both Microsoft and Sony released 4K HDR versions of their consoles. The Xbox One X and the PlayStation 4 Pro. These aren't new generation consoles, but Microsoft's currently working on what they call the Xbox Scarlet, and Sony is working on what will undoubtedly be called the PlayStation 5, with speculation saying we might see something in 2020. You can find hundreds of tech articles comparing the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One in regard to graphics, the interface, and power, but when it comes to a war like this, you eventually have two systems that basically do the same thing. What really separates these consoles now are the exclusives. Do you like Uncharted? Sony has given us many great exclusives in their lineup, including the entire Uncharted series, Bloodborne, and Spider-Man. Of course, Microsoft has given us its fair share of exclusives as well, with the Gears of War and Halo franchise, two franchises that many consider among the greatest and most influential. This rivalry began because one tech giant wanted to enter the ring in the home console market and take down what was at the time the biggest guy in the yard. Microsoft was the David to take on Sony Sony's Goliath, who sat on their laurels and let Microsoft become a top contender because of their arrogance in the mid-2000s. It's really anyone's game to lose at this point, because Nintendo can always announce a new character for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate and steal both Sony and Microsoft's thunder. And that is how the rivalry between Sony and Microsoft started, and how it was waged over the years. Which side of the rivalry do you support? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more documentary videos like this one. Thanks for watching.